provided me a little bio here, so I'm going to sort of see if I can translate this from the I to the he on the fly. I can't read it because it will be sound like I'm talking about myself. But Professor Rosen came to the Rowan School of Medicine in November 2010 after completing his dissertation in philosophy of medicine at Catholic University of America, where his studies focus on the history of philosophy, especially Husserlian phenomenology and ancient Greek philosophy. While he was in grad school, he preferred Plato to Aristotle, but since graduating, he has come to appreciate Aristotle more. So, this is one of the great debates. Those of you who don't know, this is one of the great debates in philosophy. Platonist or an Aristotelian. Some people think that this really, is the only two options you actually have. So maybe he's switching sides. I see. He enjoys teaching medical ethics and professionalism, but especially enjoys opportunities to bring insights from the history of philosophy to bear upon issues that arise in a clinical context. In addition to his PhD, he has a JD from George Washington University, and when he's not in New Jersey, he's often with his family in Washington, D.C. Tonight, he is going to talk to us on the subject. He's going to give us a presentation called Aristotle and the Neurological Determination of Death, and I'm very pleased to welcome Niel Rosen.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm very happy that you're here because I like to talk about Aristotle and the neurological determination of death. It happens to be one of my favorite topics, but it's rare that I'm in a place where people want to hear about it. So I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for coming. I'm going to move back and forth here. So I'm going to spend some time. This is a well-educated audience. But you can't assume that a well-educated audience knows a lot about the neurological determination of death. So I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time talking about the background of the neurological determination of death. What is it? To give a sense of the debate about the neurological determination of death. And then I will turn to Aristotle after raising some questions about that debate. Okay. And Dr. Kazarian pointed out that this is a work in progress. It is indeed. So I'm going to leave open questions, right? And one of the things I said in our correspondence previous to this, I wasn't turning to Aristotle to clarify things or resolve the problems, but to complicate matters. So anyway, I want to start by saying I'm not going to talk about brain death or brain dead. I'm not going to use those terms. I don't like them. Instead, I'm going to talk about total brain failure, which is a phrase that was introduced by the President's Council on Bioethics in a report it published in 2008. Total brain failure has some problems as an expression, but I think it's preferable to brain death or brain dead because it neither claims that the individual being described is in fact dead, nor does it, by using that phrase, suggest that there's some difference between being brain dead and being dead, or between death and brain death. It leaves open the question of what is the status of the individual in total brain failure? Alive or dead? If alive, what kind of a life is it? Okay, and so those are some of the questions I want to address by turning to Aristotle. And I should point out, so total brain failure is just a diagnostic category. It's a name of a condition. The status of the condition is at issue in a debate. So what's the law? Well, for the most part, the law in the United States tracks the Uniform Determination of Death Act. I'm speaking a little quickly because I've got a lot of slides I want to go through. But the Uniform Determination of Death Act, the law in the United States and most of the country, most of the world, where there is a regime of neurological determination of death, follows this track, which is to say that there are two criteria for the determination of death. One is the irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. When that happens, the person or the individual is dead. Same thing in the case of irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. Such an individual who has suffered this kind of injury is also dead. I'm not going to get into the debate about, well, I should point out that the declaration of death on neurological criteria is made under circumstances in which there are neurological functions, there are brain functions, sometimes even brainstem functions. But I'm not going to get into that debate. Those who defend the neurological termination of death would say, well, those are not clinically salient functions. So they're not a bar to a declaration of death. That's a separate debate. I'm not going to get into that. The point I want to make or underscore around the defense of the neurological determination of death is that it presupposes one biological reality. Death is the same phenomenon whether it occurs to a squirrel or a human being or a fish, right? It's the same across all vertebrates at least, right? I'm not going to defend the claim that it's the same for all animals, but I think it's fair to make this claim, or the defenders would say it's the same for all vertebrates. But sometimes you need the cardiopulmonary criteria. Irreversible cessation of cardiopulmonary function is often not adequate to determine whether an individual is alive or dead, because individuals who have suffered brain failure, total brain failure, and are being ventilated, that is to say there's some mechanical ventilation is occurring, those individuals, they're going to have cardiopulmonary function. So they'll be in the condition of total brain failure, but the traditional signs of life, breath, pulse, and warmth, they're present. So the neurological determination of death allows a declaration of death in that circumstance, right? On the grounds that the individual is actually dead despite the presence of these traditional signs of life. Sometimes those will be referred to as artifacts of mechanical ventilation or artifacts of critical care medicine. Okay, so I'm skipping over a lot of history. I'm just going to look at one very influential article published in 1981, by which time many states had followed the Uniform Determination of Death Act, right? So this was becoming standard practice throughout much of the United States. They defined death as the permanent cessation of the functioning of the organism as a whole. So death occurs when you no longer have an integrated organism, right? And they distinguish this definition of death, and they would claim that, well, when you've got total brain failure, you no longer have an integrated organism because you no longer have this complex, coordinated dynamic of circulatory, respiratory, and neurological functioning is no longer happening, right? The presupposition of this defense is that the brain is the organ of integration, is one way of putting it. And when the brain isn't working, you don't have an integrated whole. You might say you've got, to use an Aristotelian phrase, you have a heap instead of a whole, right? There's a heap of biological material and some biological activity is continuing to occur, but it's not an integrated organism. So in the same article, they distinguish the definition of death from the criteria for the determination of death. They point out, look, traditionally, cardiopulmonary criteria worked quite well. Right? When cardiopulmonary function was present, life was present. When cardiopulmonary function was absent, life was absent. You could declare death under those circumstances. But as they point out, there's no longer a perfect correlation. You can have, in the absence of cardiopulmonary function, you can have a living organism. Right? And CPR takes place and cardiopulmonary function is restored. Right? It's not brought back from the dead. It's the restoration, according to this view, right? It's the restoration of spontaneous circulation, right? Okay, but there's no longer this perfect correlation. Total brain failure, you have cardiopulmonary function, but a dead organism because you don't have this underlying integration. You just can't see that, right? So there's a way in which cardiopulmonary function masks or hides the phenomenon of death. This almost contemporaneous report called Defining Death, that was a publication of a presidential commission, talked about two windows. The cardiopulmonary window criteria was one window to observe that death had occurred, and the neurological criterion was another window to observe the very same phenomenon. But when you had someone in total brain failure on a ventilator, the cardiopulmonary window was, as it were, shut. You couldn't look in. The blinds were closed. But the neurological criteria, with the diagnostic equipment, you could open up the window. You could look and see. And so they point out, look, the neurological criteria, you have a perfect correlation. Where there's brain function, there's life. Where there's not brain function, there's death. So that's the primary rationale, long-standing rationale, for defending what's come to be known as the whole brain position. So there are three positions. There's a traditional position which says The declaration of death confirms the permanent cessation of cardiopulmonary functions, right? Permanent cessation of the circulation of vital fluids. I mean, it has a long history. That's the traditional position, and those who fall into this traditional camp would say, this is the only declaration, or the only basis for a true declaration of death. The whole brain criteria, the whole brain position, as I've just articulated, says, well, these are alternatives. For the most part, this works, but total brain failure, ventilation, you need the neurological window, right? And both of these positions would confine the declaration of death to the biological phenomenon. You can't declare death. The declaration of death is an assertion that this is a dead organism, right? Not an integrated whole. The higher brain position says the declaration, it advocates or urges a declaration of death upon the permanent loss of the capacity for consciousness, which is what a permanent vegetative state would be. Or in the case of particular neurological defects upon birth, right? A child is born without the neurological capacity for consciousness, permanently unable to develop consciousness. And so that too, in the case of anencephalic children, you would be able to declare death according to the higher brain position. One of the things that makes these debate so important is that organ transplantation is tied to these declarations of death. I'm not going to talk about the dead donor rule, which a lot of the debate turns on. Should we keep the dead donor rule or should we abandon the dead donor rule? I'm not going to address that. I'm trying to unpack these positions from an Aristotelian perspective. That's my goal. Okay, so objections to the whole brain position. And really the work of Alan Schumann, who's a pediatric neurologist at UCLA, and has accumulated a great deal of evidence about, physiological evidence of somatic integration. This is an excerpt from this 2008 publication of the President's Council on Bioethics. All these different functions are evidence of somatic integration, right? Holistic functions are occurring in individuals who have suffered total brain failure. And so as the President's Council concludes, well, if being a biological organism, being alive requires being a whole that is more than the mere sum of its parts, right, then it'd be difficult to deny that the body of a patient with total brain failure can still be alive, at least in some cases. Right? Most of these cases come from Japan, because Japan was among the last of the nations to adopt the whole brain position, right? Because the determination of life and death was tied to breath. And so there'd be many individuals who would be sustained, right? Organic functions would be sustained because there was respiratory function happening. And Schumann observed many of these cases and accumulated this evidence. There's also evidence, and so the longest case, I think the child lived 14 or 15 years, went through puberty, right? So that's a kind of strange thing. We don't think of corpses going through puberty, right? Or gestation. There was recently the case in Texas. The question is, should we provide critical care medicine to this individual so that the baby can be delivered by a C-section? Right? Schumann has undermined the traditional rationale for the whole brain position. That's not to say that it still has defenders, but there are many who have been persuaded by Schumann that it's not somatic integration. It's not this that you're in the presence, that it's impossible to be I should put it this way, total brain failure, an organism as a whole can survive total brain failure. Right? Okay, so some people would say, well, look, Schumann, the lesson from Schumann is we have to abandon the neurological determination of death and go back to the traditional position, cardiopulmonary function. Right? But there are others who say, well, you know what? We don't have to tie the declaration of death to the biological reality. We can talk about the death of the person. And there are many who make this claim. Here are two. Jeff McMahon, who's at Rutgers, and Robert Veitch, who's at Georgetown, are illustrative examples. McMahon explicitly distinguishes kinds of death. He says, what does it mean for one of us to die, right? He means, what is it, and what by one of us, he means an embodied mind. So when the irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness would be the death of the person. The organism might survive as an integrated whole, but not the person. The person has ceased to exist. So he'd say that's the death of the person, and the declaration of death should be permitted in these cases. Veitch doesn't explicitly distinguish kinds of death. Instead, he says we should advocate a pluralist position. We should have a default position. And Veitch would say, well, the default position should be the whole brain position, but we should allow people to say, do in a certain sense elect, or surrogates to elect, that the determination of death be confined to the traditional position, or that it be permitted in the case of the permanent loss of the capacity for consciousness. So interestingly enough, the New Jersey Declaration of Death Act is one of the few states it's the only state that by statute allows for a pluralist position. It doesn't allow the higher brain position, though. No jurisdiction allows a declaration of death based on the higher brain position. Right? No one in a permanent vegetative state is declared dead anywhere. Right? That's not legally authorized in any jurisdiction. But in New Jersey, if there's evidence to support the claim that it would violate this person's religious beliefs to be declared dead on neurological criteria when there's still cardiopulmonary function, then cardiopulmonary criteria must be used. Right? And this is primarily a concession. Concession is maybe not the right word. Primarily an acknowledgement of the association with or of life and breath, right? Which is very important in the Orthodox Jewish community, although not uniform, right? There's very little in the Jewish community that's uniform, right? But there are some, right? There are some who argue quite vociferously that if the individual is breathing, then the individual's alive. And you can't declare that individual dead when breathing is taking place. New Jersey acknowledges that. New York does by regulation. Now there's this third position, which is very interesting. It says the neurological termination of death, that's a legal fiction. Because these individuals are not dead. They're alive. There are these vital signs of life. They're not false. There's life taking place. These are integrated wholes. But the neurological termination of death is good public policy. It's good to be able to have organ transplantation. It's good to be able to bring to an end the life support for individuals in these absolutely hopeless and irreversible situations. So it's good public policy. But they say, well, this public policy should expand the neurological determination of death to include individuals in permanent vegetative states. Now, people like Miller and Truog, Shaw hasn't written on this. Shaw's written a lot on legal fiction. But Miller and Truog, they would argue we should abandon the dead donor rule. Right? Veitch is a chief proponent of the dead donor rule. And they also say we should permit an analog to piercing the veil. Piercing the veil is a reference to a judicial determination in cases involving corporations, right? Corporations, that's the best known legal fiction. A corporation is a legal person, right? Not really a person, right? No one goes into labor to give birth to a corporation, right? And no one suckles a corporation, except maybe metaphorically, right? Metaphorically, we can talk about that, but that's not the subject of tonight. But we pierce the veil when the corporation has strayed from, in an egregious manner, the rules which of this legal entity, this fictive person must abide by. And when it breaks those rules, then the shield of the corporation, people are not personally liable for corporate debts or corporate wrongdoings, but we pierce the veil to make them liable because of this egregious infraction, right? So here the analog to piercing the veil would be like in the case of Jahi McMath in Oakland, the 13-year-old girl who went to the Children's Hospital in Oakland in December to have her tonsils removed. After the surgery, suffered a massive bleed, which gave rise to catastrophic brain injury, neurological insult, and led to the declaration of her death using neurological criteria. Well, her family insisted that she was alive. There was breathing taking place. If we reckon, so that they would urge piercing the veil then. Don't insist that she's dead when her family is convinced that she's alive. Right? That leaves open the question of how do you finance care and those kinds of issues, but we ought not be insisting that someone is dead when others have a reasonable claim that they're alive, right? So that would be an instance of piercing the veil. Okay. All right, so now I kind of want to recap. So this is a table I've made. You can see these are the different criteria, and these are the bodily conditions or physiological conditions. No cardiopulmonary function. Everyone agrees. And in fact, this is the only condition in which there's agreement that this individual is dead. No cardiopulmonary function. And, you might try to CPR, but CPR fails. All right, person's dead. Everyone agrees. Unambiguously dead is what I would say. This person. Total brain failure. Well, these people would say they're alive. We've got cardiopulmonary function. We have evidence of somatic integration. The whole brain criterion, according to this position, say no, person's dead. These people would say, well, it's a living organism, right? Although I point out, not everyone distinguishes the kinds of death. But they would say, it's a dead person. And it may or may not be a living organism. Permanent vegetative state, the traditional and the whole brain position, they claim, well, determinations of death should be track the biological phenomenon, right? And not stray from it. So according to them, these individuals are alive. But here, according to the higher brain criterion, you've got a dead person, even if you've got a living organism, right? So additional standards, right? Is there more than one way to determine death? According to the traditional position, no. Cardiopulmonary function, person is alive or not unambiguously dead. And the only time we declare death is when someone is unambiguously dead. That would be the traditional position. The whole brain criterion would say, yes, these are alternative ways of viewing the same phenomenon. Some people say they're unambiguously dead, but they just really don't understand. This is unambiguously dead, these people would say. But, there are plenty of people who just don't get it. And then the higher brain criterion, they accept three standards, right? Person is dead according to the higher brain criterion, according to the whole brain criterion, or according to the traditional criterion. So one of the points I want to stress here is this is pretty ambiguous, right? We're dealing with individuals whose status is ambiguous. And it raises the question, is death one or many? That's one of the first questions I want to raise. And there's this problem of uncertainty. Right. Now this reflects an 18th century fear, despite the development of the stethoscope and the increased capacity to detect heartbeat. There was a great deal of anxiety in the 18th century, not exclusively in the 18th century, but it kind of came to a height in the 18th century about being buried alive. You might appear to be dead, but really be alive. And so there were contraptions that were built for you to be able to signal. If you came to soon enough, right, you could signal that you were alive. Now, I'm not a historian, and I haven't read literature about whether or not there have been instances of someone, pushing the button and the flag being raised and people going and, digging the person up. I'm not aware of this, but there are people who are buried with these in this way to be able to signal, I'm alive, rescue me, right? So one of the things that I want to say is at work in this table is, well, there's uncertainty here. We could be mistaken, except in this instance. All right? Now, someone like Hans Jonas, who some of you may be familiar with the name Hans Jonas defended this position rigorously. Said it's a vague boundary between life and death. And so we should favor life when we're in this vague boundary, right? In this uncertain condition. All right. But so there's this uncertainty, but this involves someone resembling the dead. It's new to say, well, that person only resembles the living. They're not really alive, right? They only appear to be alive. They're actually dead. That's a very different kind of uncertainty. That's a very different kind of phenomenon. Appearing to be alive but not really being alive. That's very different from appearing to be dead but actually being alive, right? It's a very strange thing, and the thing I want to say about that is what makes the neurological termination of death odd, I would say, is that it requires grasping the and then applying it. Whereas for the most part, the distinguishing the living from the dead is something we do based on our experience. So, okay, the fish is floating at the top of the aquarium, scoop it up, get rid of it. The dog has, passed away, or, whatever. We can identify that deer on the side of the road is dead. There are many ways we don't have to grasp a concept. We see it, we recognize it. Neurological termination of death, you have to grasp a concept and then see it instantiated in this body that's producing where you find traditional signs of life. That's a very peculiar phenomenon, I think, and something well worth exploring. So the problem is whether or not, or one way of stating it is whether the declaration of death should be restricted to the biological phenomenon, right? So, in case, this is the uncertainty that arises when ventilation is used in cases of total brain failure. Now, I want to point out that cardiopulmonary function is completely dependent upon the ventilator in these cases. Right? And I've already mentioned that individuals have endured for months, actually some for years. They've gone through puberty, right? I described that case. Gestated and delivered children. Strange things for dead bodies to do, right? So these are questions that these are the open questions I want us to return to at the end, right? Is death one or many? Can the dead appear to be alive? Right? Does it make sense to say, well, that person only appears to be alive, but they're really dead? I think that's very strange, personally. I'm not saying that a declaration, it's an open question to me what we're doing in the Declaration of Death, but I think it's a really strange thing to say that person appears to be alive, but they're actually dead. I think that's weird. It makes more sense if you say, well, the person is gone. That I get, right? That I get. This is actually a dead body. That I don't get. I think that's just peculiar and maybe not appropriate. But I was trying to make an Aristotelian case for the position. So, does the permanent loss of awareness signify the death of the person, right? And does the death of the person justify the declaration of death, even if the individual is biologically alive, right? This is what the higher brain position wants to say. They want to answer both those questions affirmatively. All right, so now we're ready to turn to Aristotle. And the vegetative state provides a clue because its classic description in whenever this was, 1972, is wakefulness without awareness. Now, that's a weird thing to say too. What does that mean, wakefulness without awareness? I have strived to imagine being awake without being aware, and I fail every time, right? I cannot imagine what it means to be awake and not be aware. It simply makes no sense to me at all. Wakefulness involves awareness. Now, I can imagine being aware and asleep. It's not a problem. Minimally aware, and certainly not consciously aware in the way we talk about wakefulness, and awareness is consciousness, right? Asleep and aware, yeah, sounds wake me up because I was aware of them, right? So that I can imagine. But I cannot imagine being awake without awareness. So this provides the clue of how I want to use Aristotle, because it's a separation of what life holds together. Life holds together wakefulness and awareness. You can't have wakefulness without awareness, I think. Or at least that's the clue, right? That's the clue. And it allows me to articulate these positions, I should say instead, and Aristotelian articulations of the different positions in the debate over the neurological determination of death. Much longer phrase than the Aristotelian articulation of death. Okay, so the key to biology is actually the key to Aristotle's philosophy, I think. And in this sense, I'm a follower of Marjorie Green. Her book, The Portrait of Aristotle, is an excellent, excellent text on Aristotle. So Plato, I mean, I'm not going to talk, Plato identifies being with knowing, right? What's real is what's knowable, right? The form, the ideas, however you want to describe them, right? Eidos, morphe, form or idea, right? That's what's truly real. That's which the mind grasps and knows. That's what's real. For Aristotle, that's not the case. What's real is what's living, right? In his metaphysics, the paradigmatic entity, that which is really real, is a living being, right? Because a living being is constantly at work realizing its power to be or its potency to be, right? Actualizing its potential, to use the traditional Aristotelian terms. And so what's living is what truly or really is. And to articulate or know what being is to articulate or know what life is, right? That's the foundation upon which that's the stream of Aristotelian interpretation that I'm working in. I'm going to follow the translations of Joe Sachs here for some key terms in Aristotle's philosophy, which I will put to work. Energia, which is translated as being at work. This comes actually from Jacob Klein, not Joe Sachs, but Joe Sachs learned from Jacob Klein. Being at work instead of activity or actuality. This is also reflects Heidegger's influence. Get away from the Latin Aristotle. Go back to the Greek, right? So this is Heidegger's influence on Aristotle, interpretation of Aristotle, and translation. So being at work instead of activity or actuality, entelecheia, being at work staying itself, right? So you can see being at work and being at work staying itself links energia and entelecheia, right? And forgive me for my terrible pronunciation. Just as there's a way in which activity is linked with actuality, right? But through Latin roots. Then there's this phrase, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, which gets translated as what it is for something to be. That's Sachs' translation. Green as being what it is. And its traditional translation is just essence. What something essentially is what it is for it to be what it is. The what it is to be of a thing is its essence. Okay. So these terms will show up. But what I do want to say right now is that's what living beings do. Living beings, being alive is always being at work. And the primary work of anything that's alive is work to stay itself, to keep itself going and to maintain its form. Right? That's what living beings do. So Aristotle's nature, right, his physics, is very different from our physics, right? Because according to Aristotle, every natural body has in itself a source of motion and rest, either in place or by growth and shrinkage or by alteration. So there's an inner source of motion and rest. That's what a natural body does. And natural things grow and develop. And so this notion of an inner source of motion and rest is going to be very important. Now, the inner source of motion and rest of any living thing is its soul, psyche, for Aristotle. So his book, it comes down to us as de anima, but it's really on the psyche, right? On the soul. So that articulates the being at work, the inner source of motion and rest, characteristic of any living being, right? Or that's present or at work in any living being. And he points out that what is ensouled is distinguished from the soulless by living. Okay, fair enough. So if there's activity, the reason I quote that here is that when there's some kind of being at work taking place, then we've got life happening. Now I'm going to turn to de anima, and almost everything I have to say is about this section, this passage in De Anima, chapter 2 of book 2. Living is meant in more than one way, and if any one alone, and if is present in something, we say it is alive. And then he lists these things. Intellect, perception, moving and stopping with respect to place, and the motion that results from nourishment, that is, wasting away as well as growing. So I want to list them for you from the most common to the least common. So the most common is nourishment. Right? So wherever I find nourishment, there's life. And then the next is perception. Nourishment, perception, then locomotion, and then intellection or thinking. Right? So whenever you have any of those things, Aristotle's saying here, you've got something alive, right? There's some inner source of motion and rest at work. There's a being at work. There's a being at work staying itself that the organism is doing and that Aristotle seeks to describe. All right, so here is his description of plants. I'm going to read these because I like to read Aristotle. And I hope you like hearing Aristotle. All seem to be alive, since they evidently have in themselves this sort of power and source through which they have growth and decay. The latter capacity can be present in separation from the others, being what was listed, but the others cannot be present in separation from it in mortal beings. Right? He's talking about plants and animals here. He's not talking about immortal. He's not talking about the gods. He's not talking about the planets, celestial bodies, right? He's talking about bodies on Earth, right? This is obvious in the case of plants, since no other potency of soul belongs to them. So the point he's making is that in the case of plants, you've got the power of nourishment at work taking place. And when Aristotle talks about nourishment, I want to say that's more or less what Jonas describes as metabolism in his philosophy of biology. Right? That's what nourishment is. It's the being at work. It's the metabolic work of any organism sustaining itself and growing. And also wasting away as the power diminishes. But it's the work of metabolism. Anything that is alive at all is alive by virtue of its metabolic work. And that, I believe, is what Aristotle is talking about when he talks about nourishment. Metabolism. Metabolism can happen by itself in a living being. But in mortal beings, right, and particularly in animals, as we'll get there, you can't have moving from place to place in the absence of metabolism. Nor can you have perception in the absence of metabolism. You can't have thinking in the absence of metabolism, right, when we're talking about mortal beings. Right? Immortal being, yeah, you can have it. But he doesn't get to make empirical observations about immortal beings. Makes contemplative assertions about immortal beings, but not empirical observations. Aristotle was nothing if he wasn't a very close observer of living beings. So on the difference between plants and animals, he says, life belongs to living things through this source, nourishment, or metabolism, we can say, but to an animal, first of all, through sense perception, for even those that do not move or change their places, right? If they have perception, we call animals, and do not merely say they are alive. So this it's perception that distinguishes the animal from the plant, right? Because animals, they're being at work staying, they're being at work, and the being at work staying itself of any animal is not simply through the work of metabolism, right? Because animals do not have the power to absorb nutrients. I can't just take off my clothes and then lay down on the earth and absorb minerals, right? Nor can I convert the energy of the sun into energy for my metabolic activity. I've got to capture and eat something that's already done that. A plant or an animal. But I got to capture the energy of I've got to capture that energy from another living being. I can't get it directly from the earth, nor can I get it through sunlight. Right? So in order to locate and capture food, I'm going to need to perceive. Right? Any animal needs to do this. We can get in, for the time being, I'll make the Aristotelian disclaimer that I'm talking about what is for the most part true. Aristotle has plenty of discussions of these in-between cases, dolphins and whales, right? Mammals that live in the water, right? What do we do about those? It's an interesting literature that discusses Aristotle's discussion of these in-betweeners. Okay, I'm not going to go there. And I don't want to distract myself. So Aristotle then makes this really interesting remark about the nexus of perception and desire. Where there's perception, there's also pain and pleasure. And where these are there, there is necessarily also desire. Right? Because if you touch things, it can be painful. Touch can be painful or pleasant. Right? And so any animal, he's saying, because it has perception, it also experiences pain and pleasure. So it pursues the pleasant and seeks to avoid the painful. Right? That's desire at work. Right? So that's part of, for Aristotle, the being at work of any animal. Right? It needs to do stuff beyond simply metabolizing. Right? It needs to seek out that which is good for it and avoid that which is bad for it. Right? And for the most part, Aristotle would say, at least with one of the things I've learned from Aristotle is that what makes human beings unique is, to a large extent, we're very confused about what's good for us. Right? I think that's probably the most distinctive feature of the human being, is we really are utterly confused about what's good for us, whereas any other animal you observe has no confusion about what's good for us, good for it, except perhaps animals that we put into zoos. And then they might get confused, right? But if we let them be, they wouldn't be confused, but we might not be able to enjoy looking at them. That might be a small price to pay. I don't know. Okay, so this nexus of perception and desire is very important. So, last quote from Aristotle is on the loss of touch. This is from Book 3, Chapter 13. And he says something really interesting, particularly, I think, in light of traumatic brain injuries or neurological insults, which give rise to either a permanent vegetative state or total brain failure. Not that all of them are the result of blows or injuries, but many of them are, right? Okay, so he says if they were deprived of this sense alone, touch, animals would necessarily die. For neither is it possible to have this sense and not be an animal. If you got touch, you're an animal. Nor is it necessary to be an animal to have any other sense except this one. Right? So touch alone distinguishes the organism, makes it an animal as opposed to a plant. Now, I want to also say, and I want to add to this, that with sound, an excess of sound will destroy the sense of hearing, right? Just as an excess of light can destroy the sense of sight. A defect or deficiency of light over a long enough period of time could, in some instances does, actually lead to blindness over time, right? But if we talk about it in terms of excess, too much light destroys the power of sense. Too much sound destroys the power of hearing. Too much touch, we don't say that, well, that destroys the sense of touch. We say, that kills you. That's what Aristotle is saying, right? A powerful enough blow to wipe out the sense of touch, you don't survive it. Right? Now, we live in an age where it's possible to survive paralyzing accidents. But in the 4th century BC, no, you didn't survive paralyzing accidents. I mean, surviving paralyzed accidents. It took a long time to be able to survive a paralyzing accident. So I think there's something he's saying here, and there's a way in which maybe this one could tie onto Aristotle, something here about what he's saying about in the absence of touch, we don't have an animal. In fact, he's wanting to say, well, we'd have something that was dead. Unfortunately, Aristotle's not here to examine these phenomena and tell us what he thinks. But I want to go back to this notion to get at this Aristotelian articulation. I want to go back to this notion of what life holds together. Right, remember I was talking about life holding together wakefulness with an awareness? I think Aristotle helps us talk about what's held together. Plants, metabolism, it's a holding together, an ongoing maintenance of the same, through the integration of the other, right? I mean, that's kind of what metabolism does. Expressing it formally or abstractly, that's the holding together, right? The holding together of the organism. The organism holds itself together by being in a certain kind of commerce or communion with, exchange with, however you want to, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use, with its environment. Right, and we can examine different niches to talk about the ways in which organisms hold themselves together in connection with the environment. This is the kind of thing that maybe Merleau-Ponty was very, very interested in. But metabolism is doing this. It's holding this together, right? Life holds together the organism in its environment, in communion with, so that there's a kind of permeable boundary between the two. An impermeable boundary would lead to death. Right? Animals, you hold together, metabolism is present, but also sensation or perception. Right? The Greek word would be aesthesis, in this distinction between sensation and perception, postdates Aristotle. So it's holding together metabolism and sensation and perception. And it also, metabolism, sensation, perception, and desire. Right? So there's really this triad. Three things that life holds together. Metabolism, perception, and desire. Animal life holds that together. One of the things I find really interesting about this Aristotelian thinking through these differences is I hope to begin to cash out and get your help in advancing the ball, as it were, is that I don't have to talk about the distinction between the thinking animal and other animals. This is all taking place at the distinction between animals and plants. Right? And it's taking place in a very concrete way. Aristotle gives us a very concrete language to talk about these biological phenomenon. And also I want to say to talk about integration and disintegration, right? Which are key terms when we're talking about life and death. Okay, so the determination of death, traditional position, we've got a permanent cessation of metabolism. Right? The organism no longer sustains itself by assimilating what's other than it, whether that's sunlight or minerals. Right? It's no longer being at work, staying itself at all. Right? The being at work, staying itself is done, complete, kaput. Neurological determination of death. Well, in the whole brain position, we've got a permanent separation of metabolism and sensation or perception. Because, and I didn't describe this, but the individual in total brain failure, irreversibly comatose. The 1968 report of the Harvard ad hoc committee of the Harvard Medical School to examine the definition of brain death, or something like that, I'm paraphrasing the title, did not explain why someone in total brain failure could be treated as dead. It said, look, we've got these people, it says responsible medical opinion is ready for a new basis for the declaration of death. Some of us, in fact, have begun to declare death in cases of irreversible coma, describes what an irreversible coma is, and says this is when, and if we begin doing this, the law will probably follow our lead. And that's what happened. The law followed the lead of physicians who were beginning to declare death in these cases of people who were eyes shut, completely unresponsive to external stimuli. Painful stimuli, turning of the head, eyes don't move, a variety of tests. So what you've got is, getting back here, to the whole brain position, you've got a permanent separation of metabolism and sensation and perception. So this, and what I want to say is, so the question is, in what sense is the organism at work staying itself when the what it is to be, right, this formulation of essence, the what it is to be an animal is no more, right? Because what you've got is an insensate animal. And I would assert, or at least following Aristotle, I'd say, look, an insensate animal is no animal. The question is it a corpse? Well, you've got metabolic activity happening, right? And Aristotle says where you find nourishment, you find being at work of the living, right? So again, I would say this is an ambiguous, and this is really the takeaway for me, is these are ambiguous conditions. And if you read the literature, there's very little discussion of ambiguity outside of Jonas, who says this is really vague. We can't know, or we haven't figured out how, either we can't know because we don't have enough insight, we'll never have enough insight, or we have not yet developed sensitive enough instruments to know, and it's hard to imagine how we could do so. But aside from Jonas's discussion of vagueness, there's not many discussions that really focus on ambiguity. And Jonas, I would say, really doesn't focus on ambiguity, it's on vagueness. Slight difference. Okay, but I want to propose maybe total brain failure that's what, when we talk about a vegetative state, maybe we should be talking about, that's what total brain failure is. Because we now have metabolic activity of an entity that no longer exists as an animal. So if it's alive at all, then it seems to be living as a plant. Right? Yeah, so you've got metabolism happening without touch. Right? And, well, without an inner source of motion and rest. That's it's certainly true that cardiopulmonary function is dependent upon the ventilator and intensive care. But that long list of integrating functions that Schumann identified in cases of total brain failure, those were not dependent upon the ventilator, right? That coordination of all those metabolizing functions, that was something the body was doing by itself. It's true that the cardiopulmonary function cannot work without the ventilator, basically because the heart needs oxygenated blood to continue working. And if the heart runs out of oxygen or the cells run out of oxygen, they're going to stop. But the coordination of their activity, that's not something the ventilator is responsible for. The ventilator is making it possible to energize those functions. So we might say, okay, there's a case to be made that is dependence upon an external source. But here too, it's ambiguous what that external source is causing. Okay, neurological determination of death. Well, we've got the higher brain position. We've got here what I want to say is a permanent separation of perception and desire. So it's not wakefulness without awareness. I want to redescribe it as an animal that's no longer oriented in the world, right? Because that's what desire does. The nexus of perception and desire, it orients the animal in its environment. And to be an animal is to be oriented in the world. Right? And to be permanently without orientation in the world is a kind of strange thing for an animal to be. We might say it's a strange thing for any plant to be, to the extent plants, and there are people who argue what plants perceive, and I've gotten into these discussions with folks, and they can be fruitful. Well, they're oriented too. They grow towards the sun. They do various things, right, that display an orientation, right? But in a vegetative state, the orientation is not displayed. Now, you have to be careful, though, because the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, right? We do have to be careful about that. The absence of evidence of perception or desire does not lead to the conclusion that that perception is not taking place, nor the conclusion that there is no desire. But what we can say is there's no manifestation of an orientation. And it raises to me this interesting question about, what do we say about an animal that cannot sustain itself by locating and capturing food? Right? And I want, would an individual respond to the aroma of its favorite foods, right, if there was some doubt, right? That's a brainstem function, right? This is intact in vegetative states, the brainstem. That's why you don't need a respirator. And aromas are very, that's just at the top of the spinal cord, right, where the brain meets, so at the brainstem. Maybe there's some desire, but there's certainly no manifestation of desire. Nonetheless, metabolism is happening and there's an inner source of motion and rest. There's a need to provide the food, or the nourishment, I should say. There's a need to provide the nourishment, but metabolism happens by itself. Right? So here is where I want to begin to, I think I've indicated the position that I'm trying to frame, or the Aristotelian clues for these different positions in the debate over the determination of death. And we've got metabolism, perception, and desire held together in an animal. Yet they're separated. They become separated. And this separation, it's the separation of things we ordinarily experience as united, in fact, as inseparable. Our experience of any animal life is an experience of this integration of these features. Right? Now, you might have to be someone who's very good at studying particular kinds of living beings to pick up on the manifestation of desire, or you might have to be looking at the right time. But it's there, right? Just as you have to be very good at math to perform certain kind of calculations, right? But those resolutions are there, right, for those who are capable. So we get this separation or the disintegration of what is integrated by life. I think Aristotle provides clues for talking about death in that way. Talking about substantial change, to use the kind of traditional formulation of what's taking place. Something that comes into being as an entity, a this and a what, right? You can point to it and say, there it is right there, and then you can say what it is. That, for Aristotle, is kind of it's a 2-cent version of what constitutes a being, right? Something that's both a this and a what. Not part of some continua or, a continuum. But a distinct entity that is where you can state it's what it is to be what it is. And you could describe its being at work, staying itself. You could describe its varieties of being at work. All right, so death is confirmed when life no longer holds the organism together through the being at work of metabolism. That's unambiguous. Neurological termination of death when life no longer holds metabolism and perception together. The what it is to be an animal has ceased to be. Now, I've begun to qualify this. I wrote this, but now the more I think about it, metabolism is not dependent. Cardiopulmonary function is dependent. So metabolism is indirectly dependent, right? That's an important distinction to make. But, so is it clear there's not an inner source of motion and rest? Well, it's dependent in the sense if you turned off the ventilator or withdrew the ventilator, the organism would die. That's clear. But the inner source of motion and rest, that's something that would need to be sorted out. What about the permanent vegetative state, the higher brain position? Well, life is no longer appears not to be holding together perception and desire. I want to be careful here because, again, there's this absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? But the organism certainly appears to have ceased being oriented in the world. The question is whether it's still an animal. And if it's not an animal, right, I can't make the case. I was able to make the case in terms of the whole brain position that you had an insensate animal, so the what it is to be an animal has ceased to be. And that I'm willing to say, okay, I think you can make an Aristotelian argument that's death, when the what it is to be an animal is no more. But in the case of a vegetative state, it's not so clear. It's not so clear. You have to make some argument about orientation, but then you would say, well, a disoriented animals get disoriented, right? We may be the ones who are perpetually confused about what's good for us, but animals can get disoriented. Rupert Sheldrake reports all these experiments with homing pigeons, all these attempts to to do variety of things to homing pigeons, knock them out, anesthetize them, trying to make them dizzy, take them up in airplanes, put them somewhere else, and somehow they always came back to their home. What on earth was going on, right? So homing pigeons, it might be really, really difficult to disorient it, but other animals, you could disorient them. And they do get disoriented. We wouldn't say that a disoriented animal is dead in the way that we might be able to say an insensate animal is dead, or at least doesn't exist as an animal. The disoriented, I'm having a hard time with that. But what I want to say is we're in the ballpark of the beginning of the disintegration of what life holds together. Right? So yeah, I remember, I want to remind us, right? If any of these is present, right? Nourishment is present, Aristotle would say, right? Then we've got something that's alive. But can you have a substantial change where the before state is alive and the after state is alive? That's not in keeping with what substantial change ordinarily means in Aristotle, right? It's the kind of absolute ceasing to be, or a coming into being, right, where there wasn't being before, right? Okay. Is there anything to add here? Well, so these are the questions, right? That is death one or many? Well, there's a way in which I want to say the Aristotelian ballpark is pretty broad. It seems to admit something like there is a plurality of ways of disintegration. Plurality of ways for disintegration to happen. Is each one of them the phenomenon of death? In this too, this gets to the nomos phusis argument, which is an old argument among the Greeks and later, right? And with the Greeks, but what is true by law or convention, nomos, right? And what's true by nature, right? This is one of the things so by convention, we could have conventions for declaration of death in particular cases and still not be sure whether or not the natural phenomenon of death has occurred. And so this gets us back to whether or not the declaration of death or the determination of death should track the natural phenomenon or not. Right? The higher brain position, certainly people like Jeff McMahon, John Liza, others would say, no, it doesn't need to track the biological phenomenon. But all of them would say it needs to track integration in some way. An embodied mind is an integrated entity. Veitch's phrase is bodily consciousness, right? That's an integrated entity, right? Liza has his own phrases of integration, what the integrated entity is. But I think it's much more complicated when we talk about the integration in terms of metabolism, perception, and desire. And that is much more closely rooted to biological phenomenon, observable phenomenon. And I think in that sense, Aristotle is really valuable. And one of the things I really like about working with Aristotle in this way is that we don't have to, in these cases of confusion or ambiguity, saying, well, I don't know, I'm going to turn to the expert. Right? We provide some language for trying to think these things through. This is a kind of classic aporia, right? Thinking doesn't know how to get through this problem. Thinking is stuck here. Well, that's Aristotle's philosophical method. Where does thinking get stuck? And can I think it through? And what does it take to think it through? And I think Aristotle gives us a language in terms of this integration of metabolism, perception, and desire to think it through. Now, it might be that we're not able to draw a conclusion, right? Because we might have to agree with Jonas and say, it's vague boundary. It's not a discrete event, it's a process. We might be able to mark when the process begins and mark when it ends, and might say when we're in that ballpark, this is Schumann's most recent position. He wants to give a name to when it begins and then a different name to when it ends and say, within this window, you can organ transplantation is okay. And that's kind of what the higher brain position is. When the capacity for consciousness is lost, right, or sensation and desire are no longer joined, is how I would put it. Right? And we know that there's this being that doesn't manifest orientation is never going to be oriented again. And maybe we can permit organ transplantation. Though I want to warn, there's an appropriate warning here, which is the vegetative state, permanent vegetative state, or persistent vegetative state, which is the old expression. And I want to make sure I'm leaving time. So So maybe I should, although this will be the last thing I'm going to say, is there's now a distinction between a minimally conscious state and a persistent vegetative state, because it's easy to miss the evidence of awareness in someone who appears to be in a vegetative state. And when we find it, we say, well, they're in a minimally conscious state. Well, a lot of people in vegetative states might actually be in minimally conscious states. We're just not sophisticated enough or checking at the right time. All right. Well, I want to leave time for discussion. I'm sorry that I haven't. I'm happy to stay as long as anyone wants to talk.